Hi all, welcome back. This week in this series about songwriting, we're going to work through some chord progressions. So last week we talked about melody writing, and previously we talked about using a template for your music. So this week we're going to talk about chord progressions. There's a lot of different chord progressions that you can use, and one of the confusing things about chord progressions is which one do you use, and how do you know if the melody goes with chord progressions. So let's take a minute and work through some examples. In this example, we're just using the melody we're taking a segment of the melody from Oh Susanna. Or sorry, yeah, Oh Susanna. So what you'll notice here is that the melody notes are chord tones. So in this case, to keep it simple, we're just using C major chords all the way down. C major, C major, C major. No chord changes. There's no progression there, it's just chords. And the melody notes are all, or the melody notes that are on the downbeat are all chord tones. And the one exception is this, but that's okay. That's not too bad. So when you're trying to make, the first step of making a melody, if you're not sure where to start, you can just look at the chord progression, and you can springboard off of the chord progression and just use chord tones and use stepwise motion, or one of the melodic contours that we talked about in the previous video, in order to in order to write your melodies. And so that's what's happening here, is we just have fairly straightforward, we're just going up and back down basically, but we're following the chord tones. We're staying within the notes of the chord. So that's one thing that you can do. So let's use that strategy for a chord progression, and let's just look at a very familiar chord progression. It's called the 50s chord progression. It goes 1, 6, 4, 5. We'll write that out now. Here's a 50s chord progression. It goes 1, 6, 4, 5. It sounds like this. And then you can take notes and you can add those on top and make a melody out of it. What I've done here is I've taken this melody and on all the significant beats we have chord tones here, and I've cheated a little bit here because we have some left over from that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So let's give this a listen. Cool. So that's not too bad. It's not the greatest thing ever written, but it's not too bad. So all of these important notes in the melody that are on the beats land on the chord tones. Chord tone, chord tone. And this one is kind of a hangover, so you don't even really need to count it. This one is a non-chord tone, unless you consider this. So there's two ways that you could look at this. You could consider this a 4/7 chord, or you could consider that a non-chord tone. Or you could look at it as a suspension from the 6th chord. the particulars of the theory that informs that is not super important. For right now, this one, suspending from the 6th chord, well, those are all good ways to look at it, and we'll talk about that more in a second. So that's the first thing that you can do, is you can take notes and just put them in line with the chord tones. And that's going to get you a melody that sounds pretty nice. It'll probably sound something like this. The downside is that it will probably be boring. So in order to make your melodies more interesting, what you need to do is you need to create melodies that have a balance of chord tones and a balance of non-chord tones. So we'll look at that right now. To do that, we're going to look at another chord progression. So this was the 50s progression. It goes 1, 6, 4, 5. For this next one, we're going to look at a chord progression that probably every piano student is familiar with. It's the 1, 4, 1, 5, 7 chord progression. You'll often play it at the end of a scale, depending on, you might have done that in piano lessons. Let's write that now. Alright, this chord progression, the 1, 4, 1, 5, 7 chord progression, super common in a lot of popular music. Let's give it a listen right now. So that's the progression. Now this time, instead of just using notes that fall on the chord tones, I'm going to use notes that are non-chord tones. And primarily what I'm looking for, the most useful ones are going to be notes that are suspensions from a previous chord. Those are going to be the most useful ones, is ones that are carry-over notes from a previous chord. So for example, we might use an F in on a downbeat in one of our C chord measures, or we might use a C on one of the prominent beats for one of these 5/7 chord measures. So let's see what we can do with that. So in this melody, we used some non-chord tones that are suspensions from previous chords. That gives us some color and makes things a little bit different and more interesting and more expressive. Let's give it a listen and see what it feels like. Alright, so you'll notice that for this measure with C, which basically repeats twice, all of the notes on the prominent beats are chord tones, and it's perfect stepwise motion. But then when we get to this measure, this note right here is a suspend. It's a holdover from this set of notes right here. And then we have the same thing. It's a holdover from that set of notes here. And if you listen to it, it's more expressive than the other notes around it. That particular note has some conflict in it, some depth to it, and it conveys more emotion, specifically because it's a little bit dissonant with the notes that are around it. And also here. And this one right here, it just leans right into that resolution. It's got that dissonance, and it says, I want to resolve. That's what that one's saying right here. And you wouldn't have that same thing if I just, instead of doing that, just used chord tones. Let's listen to it with just the chord tones. So with just the chord tones, it doesn't give you that same lean into, oh, I need to resolve here. It gives us an option, And so when we have those non-chord tones, those suspends, the holdovers, that says I want to go somewhere. It's more expressive. So let's look at another example, one more example, where we use a minor key. This chord progression is a 1-5-6-5 chord progression, but it's a little bit different in that the chord progression has some contour to it as well. In this case, we have A down to G, down to F, down to E, and that gives us some motion in the bass line that's supported by the chord progression. That's something that's a little bit more of an advanced technique, but it's something that you'll want to look for in practice, is how can you give the chord progressions, how can you work the chord progression and the bass line into something that's integrated together. And that's something we might talk about more in the video on bass lines, which will be in the future. But that makes your music more interesting, is when you have different parts that complement each other. So let's write a melody for this chord, or let's give this chord progression a listen. Now let's write a melody for it. In this melody, I use several other techniques. So in the last video, we talked about 3 techniques. One was stepwise motion, another was expressive intervals, and another was repeated notes. And basically, you use those 3 things to give your lines contour. So whereas this melody is all stepwise motion, this melody has a lot of repeated notes and expressive intervals, and then we finish up with some stepwise motion. So let's give the melody a listen. So this is a totally different feel to it than the previous melodies. And a lot of that just comes from the chord progression that we chose. Whereas these were in a major key, this one's in a minor key. This one has a bass line that descends, and it makes you feel differently about the music when you have that bass line that just goes down. There's sort of a subconscious reaction. And it's a very strong ordering effect to the music. In this melody, these first 2 measures are all chord tones up until this note right here and this note right here. And that gives us lean into it. So that's most of what I wanted to discuss about chord tones. Leave a comment below about what you'd like to see more of these videos on, and I hope this is helping you develop your songwriting and become better as a composer and as a songwriter. We'll see you next week.